Welcome, everyone, to DEI After Five, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After Five. All right, so if you have been following anything that has been going on in the DEI space, or even just the corporate space lately, you've noticed a couple of things. You've noticed that there have been several rounds of layoffs. You've noticed that there are DEI teams that are being dwindled down to nothing or just being let go. There's just so much that is happening. And, part of what has taken place over the last few years has been this conversation around bringing your whole self to work and being authentic. And it's kind of not happening right now. And so I want to have that conversation about what organizations need to be doing, what leaders need to be doing during these times. Because we still need to move forward, but we need to do so in a way where we're not eroding trust. And so today, my guest is Kaumudi Goda, who is the founder of The Human Conversation. So Kaumudi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sacha. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to a conversation.
Absolutely. So for folks who may not know who you are or about The Human Conversation, can you give us a little bit of your background?
Absolutely. My name is Kaumudi Goda. I also go by my initials KG. I'm a trained attorney. I'm the founder of an organization called The Human Conversation. I focus on building ethical, equitable, and inspiring workplaces. I have worked across North America, Asia-Pac region, and now I currently live in Amsterdam and therefore working with organizations in the EMEA region as well. Suffice it to say, I bring a great passion and commitment to the idea of ethics and integrity and building better systems so that all of us as individuals experience more inclusive societies. I think that's very important, is the systemic improvement. But the more work I did, the more I realized it's not just the systems, but also our hearts and minds that we need to move forward as well. And so I'm looking at that intersection right now, and I'm having great fun doing the work I do.
Absolutely. It's so interesting because as you were doing your introduction and you talked about some of the systemic changes, right? A lot of the work that's happened since 2020 and well before that for those of us that have been in this space for a long time. But really, the work from 2020 has been supposedly to look at some of these systemic changes in being more transparent about these processes and how are we dismantling some of these inequitable systems. And so part of that, or what came to me as you were talking, was, some of this work, a lot of this work was being transparent so that you can rebuild trust, because there was a lot of mistrust that was taking place in these organizations. What I was seeing didn't necessarily align with the processes that were in place. Even though you say, yes, this is a fair and equitable workplace on paper, what was happening day to day didn't necessarily tell me that that's what I was working in. And so what we're seeing now is kind of this very interesting dynamic, right? Where organizations have been saying this and trying to rebuild this trust, but a lot of the people that were put in place to rebuild this trust are now gone, right? Or are now being placed in other positions. So talk to me a little bit about, what is the dynamic shift that you were seeing right now?
Excellent, I think, point for us to begin our conversation, Sacha, because you're spot on. There's just such a sheer diversity and variety of perspectives across the world. There is indeed different contexts and different levels at which different organizations are operating. In the same organization, different offices can be operating at different levels of progress on their DEI agenda. The context also vary greatly. It might be ethnicity and nationality, or gender might be topmost burning priority for a certain office or a certain organization in a particular region, and it might not be completely relevant at all in another organization. For example, when I was serving in Asia, there is a great perception that gender equality or gender equity is a big problem across Asia, and that's true of many countries. But a country like Thailand, for instance, where there's a large representation of female executives at the top levels, that would be an unnecessary focus area. There are other areas where they could really benefit from some focus. So respecting that diversity and the sheer complexity of a DEI team, the chief DEI officer, or even the executive leadership of an organization, just the level of complexity to deal with different legislations and requirements of compliance, that it's a complex problem, right? And that doesn't help the trust gap, first of all, because we are like, that looks different in that country and it looks different where I'm working, and I don't know what you all are saying that you're woke washing is one very quick thing that can happen. Another is, as human beings, we all feel we are experts in DEI, and as a professional, that's something I often encounter. Is therefore everyone feels their opinion is actually verified fact. I have not experienced it, therefore it doesn't exist. Or my assessment is it's very bad, therefore it's true. Or my assessment is a lot of progress has been made, it's very true. So I could very comfortably talk about many male executives who say, you women have it all locked up. I mean, you're the top dog now. And that's their experience, but that's not true of all situations. And so that's another complexity, I think. And finally, the real truth of what organization pressures are varies from season to season. We've all experienced it. Through COVID, it was survival. There was a series of layoffs thereafter. And therefore, whatever progress all of us DI professionals were satisfied and feeling optimistic about seeing that we're making systemic changes, there's great focus and attention and resources being committed to this cause. All of that got severely diluted when organizations, it became an existential crisis about, are we going to survive this economic recession? And so now there's no real strength at all in their commitment towards DEI. We're all professionals working inside these organizations, and therefore we must understand these existential priorities. At the same time, as committed professionals, we know this is important. We can't abandon it as an unwanted project as soon as things become tough, which is where I think there's that trust gap that's getting worse and worse. You said it before, now suddenly you don't care about it anymore. And so what are the DEI professionals and advocates supposed to do in that situation?
Yeah. It's so true, because there were so many resources thrown at this work. And I'm so glad that you brought up the diversity within diversity, right? Across organizations, especially global organizations, it looks different. And I think so many companies that are first starting in this space put a US or North American lens on a global issue.
Yes.
And that doesn't necessarily work, right? I worked in a company where they were trying to send pronoun pins to a country, and we were just like, that doesn't translate, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense because the language was gendered. And so to talk about things that being non-gendered or non-binary was a different conversation. And so it's the maturing of the space. And I think some of that has happened during this time. But it's also using the data to tell you where you need to do the work. As you were speaking, I was working with a client not too long ago where we're doing psychological safety assessments, and we did it by gender. Well, we did it by several groups. Well, we were looking at the data on gender and race and ethnicity. And it was so fascinating because they're Hispanic men that were over the age of 55, I believe were age 50, or super high psychological safety. Like, they were living their best lives. And I said, but what's going on over here where they're younger white men had some of the lowest scores.
Wow.
And, so we started having some conversations, and they realized we've been putting a lot of our resources into supporting our women's groups, but we've missed out this opportunity of men mentoring men, right? Across gender, across race and ethnicity. And so to your point, it's what works in one area, or if you hear this generalized, we need to have more women in this space. And prime example, marketing doesn't have a women issue. Marketing doesn't have enough men in it, right? Like there's certain areas that you really need to be very specific. So I appreciate you bringing that up. The other thing around the trust, right? So we are now in a time and space where not only are the resources kind of being pulled back and employees are not trusting the organization for the commitments that were made, let's say in 2020, but you now have this anti-DEI movement that is also occurring, especially in the US, but I'm seeing it in some other areas as well, too, across the world. And so there's now this mistrust of DEI. And so, what do you say about that additional kind of challenge that the industry is facing?
It's a very real challenge. And there are multiple types of cognitive dissonance. Folks who are from perhaps non-dominant groups, who, as a result of their own lived experiences, believe that they want to work at it and improve the system they are suffering in. Those are the honest to goodness advocates. They are really trying to save a burning house, right? And so the levels of burnout and the levels of failure, feeling like they've been failed by systems that are not honestly committed to what they were saying they were, that's a real thing. There's a huge global trend of burnout in the DEI advocacy profession and sector. And on the other hand, folks who feel they weren't ready for how much push they've been experiencing. As you explained, for example, certain identities or certain groups within an organization perhaps were over-indexed, a lot of attention was paid, and therefore, as a result, others felt excluded or unnoticed, unheard, unseen. Then that naturally inadvertently causes them to feel like they got left behind, and then that therefore causes the lack of trust. Psychological safety is failed there, as you correctly pointed out. And finally, the failure of organizations to be able to walk the talk. Certain promises were made, but if we are not as strong in ensuring accountability, for example, if we have said that we have zero tolerance for bullying, or we have zero tolerance for non-inclusive words and behaviors in the office, but there's a superstar C-suite executive who's bringing tremendous progress and productivity at a time of great difficulty for the organization, and that person's simply allowed to continue to flourish. They're promoted, they fail upwards. No one dares to bell the cat in that context. Then that causes serious damage to psychological safety, because they're like, you're making us attend all these workshops and trainings, and we feel like sheep because you've told us you really believe in it, but there's no accountability. People can very comfortably, blatantly break the very policies you have spent a ton of money framing, and there are no consequences to it. And we see examples all around at every level of leadership. Those are three that I notice immediately, that where psychological safety and trust have been broken.
And I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because that's exactly what happens, right? And I say this often, your company culture is what people experience every single day, what they see and experience every single day. It is not what is written on the cafeteria wall, right? Like that is an aspiration, but what they experience. And so, that example that you gave of someone who may be a rock star in sales or another part of the business, which is great for the bottom line, but they're killing your company culture because there is no accountability. They're allowed to burn down whatever they want to burn down, or cuss out the CEO, as I had at one company that I used to work for.
Yeah.
I'm like, who does that? You cuss out the CEO and you still have a job the next day? Like, that is your company culture.
Yeah.
And so it is very, very difficult, to your point, when you invest in DEI work and training, and then you turn around and say, well, it doesn't work. Well, it's not the training that doesn't work. It was the lack of accountability that didn't work, right? You didn't do your part in creating new behaviors and new expectations and holding people accountable to that. So I want to thank you for bringing that up, but that also leads me to thinking of, if DEI goes away, right? Like, if all the offices go away, if the work is legislated at whatever level to go away, the work still needs to get done.
Yeah.
And so, as we were prepping for this, you spoke about the power of one.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about that concept a bit for us?
I think one of the biggest challenges with any sort of change management or any big change that we want to bring about around us, there's always this sense of intimidation that this is a wicked, unsolvable, complicated problem. If I pull one lever, 10 others through ripple effect are going to go topsy-turvy. Therefore, if I fix this in my organization, that's going to go bad. And so it feels overwhelming. Like, this is unsolvable. That's why the fatigue and the exhaustion and the cynicism sets in fast. However, we cannot unlearn things. The world collectively has become more sensitive to the importance of these values. There is now a reasonably well understood case for the importance of inclusion and equity. And the world cannot collectively unknow that. It's out there. And while it might seem like we've taken a long pause or even a few steps back in terms of damage done since then due to the recession and the layoffs and so on and so forth, let us hold hope that while we begin anew, we are still beginning at an incrementally better place than we were before. We have seen statistics. So, for example, one statistic I can share with you, Sacha, is even 20 years back, the level of understanding and acceptance around LGBTQIA was vastly different. So the grandparents that are around today are far more accepting of their grandchildren who identify as the LGBTQIA. And this is not because they have experienced some workshop, it's because life has taught them that if they want their loved ones, they need to step up with the time. So these changes are incrementally occurring. Let's take hope and be optimistic in believing that this happens. This is true of all wicked problems. It can feel unsolvable, but we are definitely making progress forward, however incremental it might feel. And the second thing is, we tend to feel I'm just a tiny cog in a huge wheel and I have no power, no influence. I'm the victim. However, there have been scientific studies that have proven very clearly even one person in a team who's more mindful, who will step up when someone's being spoken over, who will be an ally and an advocate about something that's important for the team, it makes a difference. It changes. It might be slow, but if 2 or 3 times we say that joke is not funny and I don't accept it, the 4th time, that person's either going to feel like a lunatic or very, very foolish indeed for repeating that behavior. So although it'll be very difficult and it'll feel like there's no hope, please don't underestimate, as a professional, a colleague, a manager, whatever your level of experience, tenure, power in an organization is, you are making a difference. That also inversely what happens is sometimes, Sacha, I'm just a manager in an organization. I've been told in confidential communication, I need to lay you off. I'm your colleague, we're friends, but I'm bound by my fiduciary duty to not disclose this to you. At the same time, you and I have been tasked with the responsibility of planning the retreat for next year. Now, I identify as a good person, but right now I'm feeling like the most unethical person and horrible friend and manager. This is the truth and the reality for many of us today. These are uncomfortable, difficult situations to navigate. And therefore, it's important to remember, be as truthful and as aligned to yourself as possible, and understand that within the various extreme constraints you have, you can nevertheless show up as a compassionate, respectful person. You can always take a moment to be kind, check in on one another, and while still remaining ethical towards your responsibilities, your duties at work, and also as a human being in a team. Kindness is possible for all of us. And that's one way in which we can somehow survive these very complicated and difficult situations.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, there's just so many nuggets in what you just said, you know, because I always talk about with clients their values. Like, let's start our work with understanding what are your values, your key values, because those are the things that you're not going to waver on. They very rarely change. You know, life circumstances may change one or two of them, but the core of your values are so important. And so when you are asked to do something that butts up against your values, that's when you have that discomfort, right? That's when you really have to sit back and think about the humanity of the situation and what you are willing to do, right? Because if something is constantly butting up against your values, or you being asked to do things that butt up against your values, then that might not be the organization for you, right? Like, that's another conversation you need to have, because I'm just seeing it so much where people are being positioned to do things that are counter to who they are as a person. And so that's one of those questions that I think the pandemic has allowed us to do, is really be reflective on what is important to us and what do we prioritize, right? And research is showing that work is lower of a priority than ourselves, right? Our families, our friends, our relationships, our community. And so all of those things are now a part of that decision-making process. The second thing, you know, which is tied to the first thing, is over the last year, I've been doing interviews of employees and working with board members and, you know, all of these things. And I cannot say that one person has said, oh, you know, forget about humanity. Every single person, regardless of the situation, is like, we need to remember that we're human and that we need to bring humanity back into the workplace, right? We are treating each other as if we're not humans. We're seeing people as things, as objects. And that is not how we want to operate and how we want to live. And so many of the policies and procedures, and even from a political standpoint, you know, your point around the LGBTQ plus population in the last 20 years, there's humanity that's tied to that. And so I think we are really getting to a point of, how do we bring humanity back into the workplace? How do I see you as a human for all aspects of who you are? And that's what this DEI work is all about. The third thing, and I think this is probably the first time I am sharing this on the show. So it's something that has been really sitting with me. So, you know, I named the show DEI After Five because it was, you know, conversations with friends after 5 o'clock. All right, what are you doing? I need a little beverage and some friends to just, right, do have those moments. But the more and more I'm doing this work, and like I said about the humanity, it is exactly what you spoke about in how are we living DEI after 5? What are we doing in our homes? What are we doing in our communities? What are we doing in our places of religion, right? Like, how are we embodying this work? Because if this work goes away in the workplace, it is not going away in our everyday lives. And so that example that you gave of the grandparents is so spot on, because that grandparent didn't sit in a corporate training to learn that, right? That connection came from love, right? Like, that was a connection to someone who was a part of you. And I am really getting into this. What does DEI look like after 5?
Beautiful, beautiful.
And so, yeah, we can talk about that, but it's something that I've been playing with, because if, like I said, if the work goes away, we still have to do it.
Yeah, That's so profoundly powerful. Thank you for sharing that. It's very true. And I think, and as I serve as an executive coach, and my observation is also we tend to forget to turn the compassionate lens towards ourselves. And most people don't appreciate the fact that if I have a very cruel, unkind atmosphere inside my head and heart towards myself, exacting standards, unforgiving, if I talk to myself as I'm so stupid, I'm such a loser, I shouldn't have done that, without realizing, I bring the same energy of impatience and intolerance towards others, even if I do not wish to be that way, because my internal lack of compassion will bleed through all of my other interactions. And therefore, the more accepting we are of our own frailties, our own failings, the more truthful we are to ourselves about why did I show up that way? Why was I uncomfortable or fidgety or dismissive just now towards somebody else? If I'm able to have an honest self-reflection there, sit with my discomfort and truly face, and this is not easy. We all daily struggle with this, right? We quickly either scroll through our phones or go take a run, anything to avoid that discomfort. But if we can sit with our own internal discomfort and be kinder to ourselves and be more encouraging rather than mean about our own frailties, we could surely turn that compassion towards others as well. Because as a lawyer, one of the things I want to acknowledge is it is not easy to walk away. Sometimes that job is the only thing that's running my house. I have bills to pay. And I most certainly don't feel I can afford to walk away for my values. I have to feed my family first. And we also know, statistically, as a lawyer, I can tell you, whistleblowers invariably pay a very steep price.
Yes.
They are disliked intensely by everybody. The peers feel uncomfortable that I showed them up. Like, why didn't they speak up? Right? And the people I report to feel like I've just now put a spotlight on their failure. Yep. And the executives feel like this is nobody wants this bomb and you've put it on my lap and I dislike you on principle of that. And so they're wildly unpopular. They usually pay a steep price. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of doing that. In those circumstances, Sacha, I just say, talk to yourself, understand, is it much more important for me to somehow survive this job right now because I need this until I figure out another option? If that's the case, it's a matter of survival, then you need to be clear in your head. Here's why I get up every day and go into this organization where I don't feel like I belong, where I don't believe I'm accepted or my values are not aligned. Here's why I'm doing it. Then you have hope. And the example I always give, not to be trite, but is that some of the world's greatest change makers, Nelson Mandela was in jail for his values for how many years? Right? Decades and decades. And so if people can survive such tremendous adversity, we are strong enough to survive in difficult, toxic work atmospheres. If that's the only way for us to get through this, I need the job, then I have to talk to myself about here's why I need it. Here's why I need to stay in. Put your head down, survive the situation while slowly making plans for your runway out, right? Your exit path. Be smart about it. And also be aware that sometimes maybe I'd much rather speak my truth. I don't care whatever penalty I have to pay, loss of job, loss of cooperation and friendliness from my colleagues. I don't care. It's been burning such a hole in my gut. I'd much rather die on that hill. If that is my take and I've thought through it, be strong and do it, because none of us will regret being people pleasers and conflict avoidant pacifists. At the end of the day, when we look back, we want to know that we have the satisfaction of being truthful to who we are. We all want that. And therefore, it's okay to think through. And there is no shame in whichever path you choose. Just be aware and wide-eyed. And if you need, speak with people like Sacha who are creating these communities. Talk to thought leaders, follow podcasts, read some books, talk to friends like After Five, as you've said. You get some external validation and verification of where your mind's at in safe places. And then you can choose.
Absolutely. And that's why I say, have that conversation with yourself, because it may be one of those two paths, or maybe a third option available, right? For me, I knew I needed to leave the situation, but hey, pandemic happened. I couldn't leave the situation, but I utilized that time to build up the foundation of my business. Right. And so it really is about what is your plan? What is having a plan in place and making sure that you feel comfortable and that sits right with you. So, Kaumudi, I want to do a little bit of a pivot and ask you, what are the things that you do to take care of yourself? Like, how do you fill your cup as you do this work?
That's an excellent question. And I have tended for the longest time to neglect it. I have now realized how important it is. One of the most important things I have learned is that while it is absolutely ideal that all of us align our values and who we want to be with the work we do, and that's what I have done, there's also great price to pay because your heart and soul are in it every day. So the outcomes of your work have a very real impact to your own sense of who you are. That also causes greater danger of feeling burnt out, cynical, let down, etc. And therefore, I've learned the importance of having boundaries.
Yes.
There are different hats we all wear. I'm an individual, but I'm also a passionate advocate because of my values. But I'm also a business owner, and sometimes I have to switch hats, and it's okay. That's one is important, very very important to one understand my own limits and assert those boundaries. And as a young business owner, Sasha, there were many times when I found a client's behavior appalling, or the way they wanted to bring me in as a consultant and the constraints they put on me. You may not talk about this topic, or you may talk, but our employees are not allowed to share anything back with you. As a young business owner, I wanted those brands. I needed that money to the revenue for my business, but I learned eventually that just makes me heartsick. And net, they're not going to be happy anyway because they weren't right in their clarity of what they needed from that project. And so understanding my limits and setting those boundaries is one thing I've learned. And secondly, to switch off. Women have always taken great pride. I grew up in the era where women took great pride in being multitaskers. Men can't multitask, but women can. Yeah, but at great price, you end up being exhausted and you have brain fog as a result. So it's not fantastic to be a martyr at work. Take time off, especially if your passion, your values, and your work are all intersecting. All the more important to say, I'm going to not do anything related to work for this weekend. I'm just going to rest and go and get some sunshine and long walks. And that's really important.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. We have to learn how to switch off. I do a meditation at night and I listen to different ones. And one of them is literally a visualization where you're switching off the muscles of your body, starting with your toes, working up. And by the time I get to like my fingers, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm just so relaxed because it's a mental, it really, we don't switch off. And to have to do that in a visualization is very impactful. So thank you for that.
I heard about it. Now I'm going to check it out.
Yes, absolutely. So for folks that want to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
I have a website. I'm based out of Amsterdam, but I work globally. So you can find me on my website, thehumanconversation.com. I'm also quite active on LinkedIn. And so I look forward to hearing from you. Any questions you have, please feel free to shoot them at me.
Wonderful. Kaumudi, thank you so much for joining us today. I truly enjoyed this conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. I loved our conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us for this week's episode. I hope that you were able to walk away with a few nuggets, a few ideas, a few ways that you could continue the work, with the power of just you. So thank you again. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. And until next time, have a good one.